Just tell her I'm still working on the captions. Mr. Gall? Come in. And, Carol, where's my other chair? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Eigen. I think Miss Flesh borrowed it to put some plants... Well, see if there's another one out there someplace, will you? Sorry. He reached across to shake hands. Things seem to be... No, that's all right. That's all right. But are you... You're not the Thomas Eigen, because I mean, there was no picture of you on the jacket of your book, so I didn't want one. And I'm just surprised that you... No, I always wanted to meet you, but I guess I mean, I'm just surprised to suddenly meet you in an office like this. Oh, thank you. He pulled the chair through the door, bent to brush the dirt off the seat. I wrote to you the first time I read it. In care of the publisher, I guess. You never got it, but I think that's the most important book one of the most important books in American literature, and since I'm a writer, I mean, trying to be a writer, well, it's nice of you to say that. He tipped his own chair back, caught the edge of the file drawer with the sole of his shoe, and pulled it out far enough to prop his feet up on it. A million more like you, and I'd be... But you must have known when you were writing it. You must have known you were writing it for a very small audience. Small audience? His feet dropped. Do you think I would have worked on it for 7 years just for... Do you know what my last royalty check was, Mr. Gall? Mr. Gall. $53.52. The publisher dropped it cold the day it came out. He must think I wrote it for a very small audience, too. Yes, I know. I get letters from college kids who have it signed in their courses. They must be passing one copy around. If you'd let me have the rights back, do you think I'd be sitting here right now? That was like my 5th attempt to read that. It's very hard to read out loud. Not because it just doesn't read like literature. It reads like somebody speaking. And this is from J.R. by William Gaddis. One of those notorious books that is considered one of the hardest books to read. And, well, let's just get into it. Why is it so hard to read William Gaddis before we talk about what this passage is about? Well, obviously the first thing that is difficult about William Gaddis is his use of the end dash instead of quotation marks to set up a quote. So all of this stuff here, excuse my mouse pad, all of these little end dashes are the quotes. Instead of quotation marks, instead of doing this, like so, Gaddis just used the end dash. He wasn't the first to ever do this. It's definitely been done before by other famous writers, James Joyce and some other German writers. I should have fixed this before I started recording. Oh well. But you have to get used to it. And that's the first hurdle, I suppose, when you read Gaddis, is the end dash, which is something most readers are not accustomed to. The first time I read one of his books, I was quite overwhelmed because I had to realize that some punctuation marks were part of the quote, while others were actually the end of the quote, and then it would go into like descriptive language, and it takes a while to get used to. But once you get used to it, you can kind of catch on. This is the third book of his I've read, and apparently this is the hardest one of his. And I would probably agree. I'm 500 pages in, and some of the things about Gaddis' style in this book in particular is, well, first of all, this book is mostly just dialogue. There is a descriptive language. There's some right here, right? He pulled the chair through the door, bent to brush the dirt off the seat. Okay, that's in the middle of this paragraph, which is all a quote of what the character is saying, right? Mr. Gall. And that's what he did while he was talking. But it's not always obvious when you're reading quickly what is dialogue and what is descriptive language, and if you're not careful, you could get confused real quick in this book. And the transitions in this book, sometimes Gaddis will have like a long descriptive section that kind of moves the character from either nighttime to morning, from one location to another, and those are the easier ones to catch. And the harder ones are when, like, it's a telephone call and one character is talking and you've been following this character for 20 pages, and all of a sudden he or she is on a telephone call and it goes to the character on the other side of the line all of a sudden. And then you're just immediately in that, like, office setting where that character is talking to his secretary or something, and you're like, what the hell just happened? Who is talking now? And that happens more than once. So those things happen. That's one of the transition tricks he uses. There are no chapters in this book. There are no breaks in this book. It's just 700 and some pages of mostly dialogue, and there are no little short breaks between paragraphs. None of that. It's just nonstop. So the transitions are technically going to be your chapters, but if you well, I mean, that's usually where I stop if I can get to one of them, and sometimes it's hard to get to because there could be 50 pages before you get to a transition. So it's hard to read, just for those facts alone. And then a lot of this dialogue is written in this, almost in the style of, I wouldn't say a play or theater, a drama or something like that, but more almost like radio, a play on the radio, like where the characters would have to, you would interpret what the characters are saying as a movement. So he doesn't always talk about or describe what the characters are doing and saying. Sorry, he always says what they're saying. He never describes what they're doing in descriptive language. He'll do it in the dialogue. And there's an example of that here. Just in the first line, just tell her I'm working on the captions. He's talking to his secretary, Carol. And then all of a sudden he's talking to Mr. Gall, right? Mr. Gall, who's coming through the door. So you have to interpret this. You have to interpret that Eigen is in his office, and all of a sudden Mr. Gall is walking in, right? He had an appointment with or whatever, and then he says, come in. And now he addresses Carol again. So it's this back and forth. This is part of why it's so difficult to read. Where's my other chair, right? Now we're assuming that the chair is important, and soon enough it will be, right? Blah, 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 blah. He shakes hands. Okay, and then when we get down to this paragraph, it's Mr. Gall who is speaking. No, I always wanted to meet you, but I guess I'm just surprised to suddenly meet you in an office like this. Oh, thank you. He's not talking to Mr. Eigen. He's talking to Carol, who's come back in with the chair. He pulled the chair through the door, bent to brush the dirt off the seat. So it's hard to catch these things when you're reading, because it is completely different than what most authors do. And the best I can describe this is it's almost like Gaddis he wrote this in, well, I'm sure he wrote this over a long period of time, but it was published in 1975. And by that time, television was a mainstay of American culture. And it almost reads like a long television show. Like, the transitions could almost be described like jump cuts between one scene to a next, right? All of a sudden you're in one scene and then you're in another scene. There's no chapter. There's no putting the television down for another day. It just goes to a new scene. And as viewers of television and movies, we are used to that. But we're not used to that in a book. But that's what happens in this book. It's like a television show. But it's just those subtle little things that happen to add to the descriptive language. So there are times, right, when the descriptive language adds to what's been said. Small audience, his feet dropped. Okay, he was holding his feet up like on a filing cabinet, like he's proud of himself that somebody recognized him for his book and being an author. And then all of a sudden, what Mr. Gall has to say about that makes him sit up. And all this has to be interpreted. Gaddis wrote as though his audience was intelligent. And, well, not necessarily intelligent, but at least experienced enough to interpret what's going on for themselves. He doesn't hold your hand at all. There's no hand holding. You just have to be smart enough and understand the context of what's going on in the scene between the characters to understand some of the things that happen, the movements that they make. I haven't quite finished this book, but so far what I can say is it's also difficult for the fact that there's a lot of characters, and a lot of characters that are they go back and forth between each other, and it's hard to keep up with one character's relationship to another because it's like a giant circle of relationships. They don't all know each other, but it's like 6 degrees or 7 degrees of separation. They all know each other through each other. But the main character, if you can call it that, of the book, JR, is this school child who starts a business, and I think Edward Bast is more the main character, and JR kind of uses Edward Bast as a tool for his business because Bast is old enough to meet adults and carry out all the things that JR has in store for his business that he starts. But JR is rarely in the book. He's rarely in the book. And when he does pop up, you don't always catch his name. And it's not always given. You just have to know JR by the way he speaks and the way he's described. He's always carrying a lot of crap. So he's always dropping stuff. He's always stumbling over things. And it's literally crap. It's described like just a bunch of junk and stuff. And he's always carrying it. And the way he talks, you just have to catch. You have to catch all the idiosyncrasies of the characters to know a lot of times which character is talking. And there are passages in this book where I read, and then I just lost track of who the hell was talking. And then at some point, I don't think it matters because what they're talking about is the point, right? This is a satirical book about, I wouldn't say capitalism necessarily, but it is about capitalism. It's more about American economics, at least in the 1970s, and how everything is commodified, especially the arts. And this is what this kind of passage is like about, I suppose, in a way. And the reason I chose this passage from like 442, page 442, was because in the few interviews I've seen from Gaddis on YouTube and some of the things that people talked about Gaddis, his first book, The Recognitions, which I did a video for, which was quickly became my favorite book ever. What happens here to Mr. Eichen is what happened to Gaddis. He eventually went back to just a bland, old, boring job after writing that book. And there's clips of him saying, the exact words that are in this book down here. I get letters from college kids who have it assigned in their courses. They must be passing one copy around, right? Because it didn't sell any copies on its initial publishing in 1955, but somehow there was like this cult following. But where did the sales go? Where's the money? Right? Where's my back end? The character Eichen wants to know, and so does Gaddis. Gaddis is writing about himself in this passage, essentially. And Mr. Gall is not an important character. He's just some random bloke. And this passage is more of a digression than anything. I mean, it's sort of about what Gaddis talks about, but I think it's Gaddis just putting his frustration into the book, into one of his characters. Right? Eichen writes an important book, apparently, that makes him no money, so he has to work this boring desk job. And this Mr. Gall comes in, who recognizes him from his writing, not because he knows what he looks like, but because he's smart enough and experienced enough to have read that book for a small audience. So that brings me to I guess, another point I want to make. What is a small audience? A small audience is not necessarily intelligent people or dumb people. It's experienced people, right? I could never have read this book even 10 years ago, especially when I was 20. If I tried to read this book when I was 20, I would have been lost. Completely lost. No clue what the hell was going on. And reading is like any other skill. It's like playing an instrument, playing the piano. It's like cooking. It's like playing a sport. It's like any skill in the world. If you intend to get better at it, you will. And reading is the same. It's a skill. You can get better at reading. And experienced readers are the audience for this book. Which is funny because this passage is like, I didn't write it for a small audience, but Mr. Gall points out, well, I'm afraid you did. There's an irony in the fact that you wrote this way. You wrote a book that's difficult to read. So who the hell do you think was going to read it? If it's, it's Gaddis also acknowledging the fact that he's upset that nobody read his book, but he realizes that it was difficult now. Maybe in 1955 when he first published it, he was all excited, and then all his hopes were let down, and nobody gave a damn about it. And it wasn't until this book was published 20 years later that people realized who the hell he was, and went back to the recognitions and then lauded it for being one of the great American novels. And the people who laud books like that are experienced readers. They're not necessarily the most intelligent people. They're not necessarily the most wise people. They're not necessarily dumb or unwise. None of those things. They're just experienced. They've practiced reading. They're good at reading. And there's not a lot of people who read to the point where they can understand one of Gaddis's books, especially this one. I'm surprised. Well, I'm not surprised because it's good, but it's so difficult at times to read. And there are points in this book you're like, I don't care anymore. This is kind of boring. You put it down for a bit. This is not quite the grab as the recognitions, but it's good. There's some funny moments in this. And there's a lot of motifs in this book. Gaddis really got away from using metaphor. Well, he uses metaphor, but he uses it very covertly. One of the things I noticed was one of the more prominent characters in the book. God, I forget his name because they're all so close and similar. I think it's Tom. No, it's not Tom. It's Jack. It's Jack Gibbs, I think. Yeah. He is a teacher who talks about entropy. He gives a lecture on entropy in the beginning of the book. And entropy, of course, is essentially everything just devolves into chaos. And that's what happens to him in the book, right? That's how the metaphors are created. Like, he becomes the embodiment of chaos. He just becomes a drunk. His life's falling apart. He's getting divorced. He has to go through all these alimony things and child support cases, and all of this is weighing him down and tearing him down. His friends are dying, jumping out of windows, right? He's in a crappy apartment, and that's how the metaphors are created. And there's a lot of motifs, which I haven't quite caught on to some of them, how they work, but like one of the motifs is shoes. There are shoes everywhere. Everybody, Gaddis is always talking about the shoes of characters, right? Even in this passage, he put his shoes up. Soon after this, or before this, a character watches his secretary walk out the door and down the aisle, and their shoes go clip clop, and it's that thing. And then there's, I think it's Gibbs. He has one shoe at some point. He's wearing one shoe, and it's torn apart. And he's always trying to give a shoe to He was trying to give a shoe to a kid who was selling things and things like that. And there's always something to do with shoes. And another motif I noticed was cars are always mounting curbs. When they're driving down the street, they mount the curbs, right? What the hell that has to do with anything, I haven't quite figured it out. I mean, this is only the first time I've read this book, and it's not one of those books that you can catch everything the first time, but I started to notice these things, like, because you see it again and again and again. Cars are always mounting the curb. There's always shoes going on. Another motif, it hasn't happened as much, but in the beginning of the book, there's two old ladies. They're the Bast sisters, I guess, who are inheritors of the estate of James Bast, who is not in the novel, but he dies. And their street is like all the trees are like haunted and like attacking the cars and things like that. There's just these weird motifs that I haven't quite all figured out. Another one where Bast is staying in, I guess, the later part of the book. He's staying in an apartment, I think with Gibbs, Jack Gibbs, or at least next to Jack Gibbs. It's hard to catch. And that apartment is full of all sorts of crap that JR has bought and plans to sell. Like he's got the warehouse that Bast is living in, and there's always talking about bumping into these stacks of 2-ply toilet paper rolls. Like, it's kind of a play on things like, this is all bullshit, so we need the toilet paper, right? Everything is bullshit in this apartment. Nothing works in the apartment. Bast keeps all sorts of things in the bathtub. The sink is always running and doesn't stop. And the other characters are concerned about it. It's just a mess. There's no food, and there's just junk everywhere that JR has bought and plans to sell, and he has this fancy telephone line put in and all sorts of other things going on in this crappy apartment. So, and all of it is, something you can wipe your ass with, essentially, is the point, right? Business is something, the business of all of this crap is just something you can wipe your ass with. That's what Gaddis is getting at. That's the satirical point of the novel, right? The fact that a 12-year-old or something like that could start a corporation just proves how nonsense it all is. I mean, there's a huge portion of the book at the beginning that goes over what stocks are, and Gaddis goes into how much of a fraud it is. And JR is the one that points it out when he's always asking questions at this on this field trip to Wall Street. And the questions are always just kind of brushed aside by the people giving the tour, like, oh, that doesn't mean anything. Don't worry about that. And that's kind of like, that's how Wall Street treats the American public. Oh, don't worry about that. That doesn't mean anything. You don't need to know about that. All about that. That's because if you did know about it, you would realize it's all horseshit. It's all bullshit. So that's what Gaddis is getting at. This passage is kind of quintessential of the style and the difficulty, but it's a fun book. I do recommend it if you are either looking for a challenge and want to become a better reader or are a good reader. Give it a try. Take care.